Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to a deck tech on what we've been calling Gary's Bouncy Castle. This is a Demir mid-range combo kind of control deck that we built on stream a few weeks ago. This deck was built with the work of my stream as well as with the help of my stream and actually obtaining some of these cards. Special shout out to a handful of them for making it actually possible to build this deck because I did not have many of these cards on hand. But let's get into the list. So let's start off with it. Let's get into the lands. We have 9 islands and 5 swamps. I probably can go up a little bit more on swamps because the deck does use a pretty reasonable amount of black mana. But I'm a little bit heavier on blue, mostly to help us get to counterspell turn 2 or 3. But if you play this deck and you feel like that the black land is a little bit too low, you probably can go up a little bit higher on swamp, probably one more swamp, but I wouldn't go much higher than that just because you do run the risk of not being able to hit counterspell efficiently early in the game. The actual lands with abilities that we have 1 Bojuka Bog to help get rid of graveyards, as well as 2 Dimir Aqueduct, which work nicely to let us reuse Bojuka Bog over the course of a match. We have 4 Dismal Backwater. These lands are mostly our mana fixing. We don't run any Ash Barrens or Terramorphic Expanse or anything like that. Just a number of basics and some dual lands here. Next we have our 1-drop spells. We have 4 Preordain. Preordain being just this deck's cantrip of choice that we don't really have any way to shuffle our deck because we're not playing anything like Ash Barrens or Ponder. We're not running anything like Ash Barrens or Terramorphic Expanse or anything like that. So we don't really have any way to shuffle our deck. So we chose not to go with Ponder, and for the same reason, we don't really want to go with Brainstorm. So for us, Preordain was our cantrip of choice. Next at 1-drops, we have 3 Disfigure. Disfigure being just a pretty cheap instant speed removal spell. Being able to kill many things in the format for simply 1 mana is really nice. Kills Delver's Pre and Post Flip, kills Moldrifters, kills a lot of stuff that we care about, and being only 1 mana makes it nice. It doesn't kill everything, but you can sideboard it out in the matches where it's too small to hit a lot of stuff, and it's pretty inconsequential. Because it is a minus effect, it also can be used as a pretty efficient combat trick to help your creatures block or attack more efficiently than they normally would be able to. Next, we have 4 Spellstutter Sprite. The Spellstutter Sprite is a little bit of a weird inclusion in this list that many people have looked at and said, well, you're not running other fairies, so why are you running Spellstutter Sprite? Well, Spellstutter Sprite is actually very, very good in this deck because you only run 4 Counterspell. You're not running any like Essence Scatter or any like Essence Scatter negates or dispels or any weird situational counterspells here. So when you're only running 4 actual counterspells in a deck that is as slow as this, sometimes you either don't draw enough counterspells or you run out of counterspells. And for us, Spellstutter Sprite is there as our situational counterspell. That Spellstutter Sprite is able to help us out in the early game, to help us counter 1 and 2 drops, to help us counter Lightning Bolts and Duress and enemy Dispels and Disfigures and other cheap spells that people are trying to play. It's really good at countering cantrips to slow our opponents down. That Spellstutter Sprite is there to counter what we deem not important enough to use an actual counterspell on. And the fact that it's a creature means it can be reused by Cavern Harpy and Ninja the Depowers and the Shinobi. Next, we have 4 Counterspell on here. Just simple Counterspell. We're a slower deck, we're in blue, so we love us some Counterspell. We do have a little bit of synergy on Counterspell with our Chaomancer, but that's the extent of the synergy here, as most of the combos in this deck are creature-based. Next up, we have 3 Chainer's Edict. 3 Chainer's Edict, of course, being target player sacrifices a creature, and we can flash it back to do it again for 7 mana. This deck is a slower deck, and so we do very often get to flash back Chainer's Edict. In some decks, where this deck, in some faster decks, you might run Diabolic Edict in this place, or even things like Victim of Night. However, this deck is slower, and we will get enough value out of the flashback on Chainer's Edict to make it worth it for us. Next, we have 3 Agony Warp. Agony Warp serving as a basically slightly larger Disfigure with a little bit more flexibility to it. Agony Warp being able to put -3/-0 on a creature and -0/-3 on a creature. This can be the same creature or this can be a different creature. being instant speed and being for a blue and a black makes it a little bit easier on our mana base. So Aghanim Warp being basically Lightning Bolt with more flexibility in this deck, that because it's a //, it kills creatures with indestructibility. Because it is a //, it also makes combat math more difficult for them. Because you can put it on multiple different creatures. You can use it to fog one creature and kill another creature. You can use it to make 2 different creatures trade profitably. But the flexibility on Aghanim Warp is really a huge deal, outside of it just being able to just kill something when you need it to. The next card up here is 3 Cavern Harpy, and this is really one of the core cards of the deck. Cavern Harpy being a 2 mana for blue and a black flyer, then when it comes into play, you return a blue or black creature you control to your hand, and you can pay 1 life to return the Cavern Harpy from play to your hand. This is a 1-card engine. This is a 1-card engine that you play it bounces a creature, and then it bounces itself to let you replay it to bounce that creature that bounces itself, and you can just keep going back and forth. This is very, very good because it is a card that, while it doesn't combo with itself, it's a card that serves as kind of it flickers. It's a flicker effect all on its own. This is a reusable kitty. It's a kitty that we can just use over and over and over. And that's why we're only running 3. That while this is a cornerstone of the deck, we don't actually need them in multiples, because Cavern Harpy has the rare distinction of not dying to removal. The ability to return itself to our hand for 1 life means that it really doesn't die to removal. Also, the ability to bounce it to our hand allows us to fog people's creatures. Somebody attacks in with a Gurmag Angler, we block it, we bounce the Harpy out, we paid 1 life to prevent 4 damage. Seems reasonable to. So, the Cavern Harpy is a reasonable blocker, it's a reasonable attacker, having 2 power in the air. It's a good blocker, being able to fog creatures for a turn. Its ability to repeatedly bounce creatures to our hand, most of our creatures having EBT effects being relevant in that case. It's just one of the cornerstones of the deck, and is really the engine that lets this deck work. Next up, we have 1 Dimir Infiltrator. Dimir Infiltrator is a card that a lot of people look at and go, huh? But trust me, it's actually very, very good here. 1, it has Unblockable. This helps combo with our ninjas. 2, it's a 1/3. It's a 2 mana 1/3. This makes it very, very good at blocking against aggressive decks. 3, it has Transmute for 2 mana. That this is not just another copy of Cavern Harpy. This goes and gets Counterspell, Aghanim Warp, Chainer's Edict, Spellstutter Sprite. This card is an effective other copy of any of these cards. And because this deck can bounce creatures, if you have this in your opening hand, you can play it down on turn 2 as a blocker or an attacker. When the mid-game or late game comes, you can bounce it back to your hand with the Cavern Harpy or with the Ninja, and then you can transmute it to go get a card that you need. This card is very, very efficient and very powerful in this deck. Unfortunately, it's a little bit slow, and it doesn't do a lot proactively, and so we're only running 1. But its flexibility is awesome, and I definitely love it in this deck. The next card up, we have 3 Seagate Oracle. Seagate Oracle being a 3 mana 1/3 that when it enters the battlefield, we Sleight of Hand. This is a cantrip on a body, and that's sweet. It's a 1/3, so it blocks pretty effectively in the early game, as well as being a reasonable amount of toughness to have to try and fight through in the mid and late game. That, as well as, of course, all of our creatures with enter the battlefield triggers comboing well with the Cavern Harpy. We have 2 Phyrexian Rager. Phyrexian Rager being 3 mana for a 2/2. Then when it enters the battlefield, we draw a card and lose a life. This is serving the same slot as Seagate Oracle. That Seagate Oracle and Phyrexian Rager basically do about the same thing, but in slightly different ways. Phyrexian Rager is better at attacking because it's a 2/2. It's better at doing damage, at being aggressive. The Seagate Oracle is a much more defensive card. Seagate Oracle's card draw is better, having the Sleight of Hand effect. However, if you see 2 good cards on top of your deck, well, now you've put one of them on the bottom of your library, and that's not great for you in some situations. So, they both do very, very similar things and serve basically the same slot in the deck, but do them slightly differently enough that I want to run both of them. As well as Phyrexian Rager having black pips to help make our Garys more powerful. Next card up in the deck, we have 2 Chittering Rats. Chittering Rats being a 3 mana 2/2 that when it enters play, target opponent puts a card from their hand on top of their library. This is a very, very irritating card. This card is so annoying to play against, and such a speed bump for a lot of decks. That being a 2/2, is not insignificant. That the fact that it does take either a disfigure to kill, or normally 2 power means it's going to trade with something in combat if you're early in the game. So it's normally going to slow them down by putting a card on top of their library, messing up their draw, messing up whatever plans they had, as well as taking another card to kill, or just serving as some way to screw up combat for a little while. As well as Chittering Rats offering 2 black pips to power up Gary. The ability to reuse Chittering Rats with Cavern Harpy is very, very irritating to fight through. If you stick your opponent with a card in their hand that they can't cast, whether they don't have the requisite colors to, or they don't have enough mana to, you can just Chittering Rats lock them. That just by Chittering Ratsing them every turn, bouncing with Cavern Harpy, bouncing with the Chittering Rats, just sticking them with one card in their hand that they're just constantly putting on top of their deck over and over, and never actually get to play. So that's very irritating, but it's very, very powerful. And this, while just being a reasonable mid-range / control card, also has the opportunity to possibly be a hard lock in some situations. Next up, we have 3 Ninja the Deep Hours. Ninja the Deep Hours being a 4-mana 2/2 with ninjutsu, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Ninja the Deep Hours, of course, having the notorious combo with Spellstutter Sprite that is seen very often in Mono Blue Delver, but in this deck, it serves the purpose of not just bouncing Spellstutter Sprite, but bouncing most of our creatures with abilities, as well as being a source of card draw in this deck. Being a 2/2 is not amazing, it has a smaller body, but most of the time you're playing this for only 2 mana anyway, and the ability, the actual ninjutsu ability putting it onto the battlefield cannot be countered. So, a lot of the times this is an uncounterable source of card draw, that a deck like Delver can't actually stop you from doing this. That yes, they can Vapor Snag or snap it back to your hand, but they cannot actually stop you from putting the ninja onto the battlefield and getting the creature back into your hand. So if you need to get a Spellstutter Sprite back in your hand, you need to get a Phyrexian Rage or something else back, you can do that with the Ninja the Deep Hours, and they cannot stop you. Next up, we have 1 Archaeomancer. Archaeomancer being a 4-mana 1/2 that when it comes into play, you return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. This is the only source of graveyard interaction that we have in this deck, outside of if you count the flashback on Chainer's Edict. This is technically infinite counterspells with Cavern Harpy. We can get back counterspells infinitely, we can get back Agony Warp infinitely, Preordains, whatever we want. However, I didn't want this deck to really become graveyard-based, and that's so mana-intensive. It is so incredibly mana-intensive, and especially blue mana-intensive to go Cavern Harpy, Archaeomancer, Counterspell, play that Counterspell. That it's very slow, it's very expensive, it's very hard to actually pull off. And I didn't want that kind of lock strategy to really become one of the keystones of this deck. That's something you can do, it's an option available to you, but for the most part, this is just a value creature that can also, like the rats, serve as kind of a hard lock when you really need it to. Next up, we have 3 Grey Merchant of Asphodel. We have good old Gary. Gary notorious from his time in Standard and Mono Black Devotion in Theros, where he gained his fame. Gary being a 5-mana 2/4, where when he enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, and you gain life equal to the life lost that way, where X is your devotion to black. Gary being the primary win condition in this deck, that sometimes you can win by simple combat damage, by just punching in, locking people out of the game, getting them with flyers, that you can do that. It is an option in this deck, but more often than not, you're winning through Gary's. And unlike Mono Black Control, that normally likes to win through one very big Gary, where you get Oubliettes or Pestilences and multiple Chittering Rats and a Phyrexian Rager out, maybe a Witches, you play Gary for 12 and kill your opponent. That's not what this is. This is multiple smaller increments of Gary. You play Gary for 3, and then maybe 4, and you bounce it, and you play him for another 4, and then you bounce him, and you play him for another 4. But that's how this Gary wins, that you're using Gary and Cavern Harpy to kind of work together. That Cavern Harpy's bounce loses you life. Gary gains you life, so they offset each other. And then as long as you have Cavern Harpy on the battlefield first, when you play Gary, now Gary's devotion is 3. So just these 2 cards together, deals 3 damage every turn, and heals you for 2 every turn, as long as you can keep looping them. And it's a very powerful combo and a very powerful synergy that can help to not close out games quickly, but can help you stay in games that you're struggling on, They can help you push through a board stall, because you cannot negate the life loss from Gary with something like a Circle Protection, as well as Gary being a 2/4 means that it blocks very, very well, that there's only a handful of things in the format that can attack effectively through Gary. The final card in the main board here is one Akiba Gang Shinobi. Akiba Gang Shinobi being a 5-mana 3/2 with ninjutsu for 4, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards 2 cards. Akiba Gang Shinobi being another ninja with ninjutsu, so it can once again help get our creatures out of play to let us reuse their in the battlefield effects, as well as serving 2 black pips. They discard 2, being incredibly powerful in situations as well. When an opponent cannot deal with the Shinobi immediately, if somebody cannot kill the Shinobi the turn it comes out, or the turn after it comes out, they're probably going to lose this game, because most decks can deal with discarding 2. Not a lot of decks can deal with discarding 4, or 6, or 8. When you start getting the situation where you force them into talk deck mode, most decks are going to lose, especially when they're facing down multiple black pips, because once again, Shinobi provides 2 black pips to power up your Gary. So, that was the main board. Now let's get on to the sideboard and discuss that a little bit. Okay, so here we are in the sideboard. Let's go through these. First up, we have 2 Relic of Progenitus, this being, of course, just kind of generic graveyard hate. Its ability to passively tick away at graveyards is very useful, as well as its ability to draw us a card and blow away all graveyards for simply 1 mana. Some people have argued that maybe you want Nihil Spellbomb in this deck, but we're not a graveyard-based deck ourselves, so I felt that you don't actually need Spellbomb in this deck. That I feel that the constant ticking mode of Relic to exile graveyards is more powerful than Nihil Spellbomb not exiling our graveyard, because really we don't have any graveyard interaction. We don't mind if our graveyard gets destroyed. Maybe we lose a counterspell, maybe we lose something that we could have brought back, but we really don't have much graveyard interaction, so we don't mind losing it. Next up, we have 2 Annul. 2 Annul, a number of Annul I feel are 100% a must-have in this deck. This deck is blue and black. Blue and black have no real way to deal with artifacts and enchantments. That's unfortunately just a weakness of the color pie, is that these colors are bad at that thing, unfortunately. So, Affinity is an awful matchup for us. We need some number of Annul to be able to deal with big scary threats, things like Mirror Enforcer. We cannot let those happen. Being able to counter those for simply 1 blue mana is 100% must in this deck. Next we have 2 Hydroblast. Hydroblast, of course, being the modal to let us counter a red spell or destroy a red permanent. This is our catch-all against any red deck. Any deck running red, we pretty much bring this in. Next up we have 2 Duress. Duress, of course, being able to, for 1 black mana, look at an opponent's hand and choose a non-creature, non-land card from it and discard it. Next up we have 2 Shrivel. Shrivel, of course, helping us against tokens, against elves, against Stompy, against things like Mono White, against Kitty occasionally if they run the Kuldotha Rebirth version. So Shrivel being very good against Mono Blue, just being a really irritating combat trick. We definitely need some answer to early game threats, to swarm strategies, to stuff like that, and we've chosen Shrivel here. Next up, we have 1 Auraflux. Auraflux giving all other enchantments an upkeep cost of 2, or you sacrifice them. This is amazing against decks like Boggles, Torch Existence, a handful of other decks that really love their enchantments, things like Acid Wash, and a handful of other decks that rely pretty heavily on enchantments. Even Kitty sometimes runs 4 Journey to Nowhere and a few Oblivion Rings. So having Auraflux to be able to deal with enchantments, which is something that blue and black normally don't get the ability to, is incredibly key in this deck. Next we have 1 Parasitic Strix. Parasitic Strix serving as a mini Gary for this deck. It's an artifact creature for 3 mana. It's a 2/2 flyer. When Parasitic Strix enters the battlefield, if you control a black permanent, target player loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. This is very, very good for us because Parasitic Strix is basically a more mana-efficient Gary in a lot of situations. That if we're facing a deck where we need either more creature spells or we need to go a little bit faster, we can use Parasitic Strix to combo with the Cavern Harpy to start doing that Gary loop to gain life and deal damage, but for less mana. As well as it being a flyer is not irrelevant, so it can get in for that damage in the air or help block more creatures in the air if need be. Next we have 2 Choking Sands. Choking Sands allowing us to, for 3 mana, destroy target non-swamp land. If that land was a non-basic, they take 2 damage. This is very good for land destruction, being able to blow up Karoo lands, Tron lands, stuff like that. Sometimes there's just troublesome lands that you need to deal with. And the final card here in the sideboard is one Soul Manipulation. Soul Manipulation being for 1 blue, 1 black, and a colorless, allowing you to choose one or both. Counter creature spell, or return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is awesome, because this is an Essence Scatter with a tacked on effect that I'm willing to pay 1 extra black on my Essence Scatter to return a creature from my graveyard to my hand. That if a Cavern Harpy has died or a Grey Merchant has died over the course of the game, being able to add that extra counterspell into my deck to help deal with some of these mid-range or control matchups, as well as being able to get back some creatures in the mid-range and control matchups where creatures are much more likely to die, is very, very important. So we have 1 Soul Manipulation in here to help with that a little bit, as well as give us a little bit of a way to reuse some creatures who have died. So guys, that's the deck. The deck list, of course, will be linked down below. If you guys have any other questions or comments or anything about this deck, please feel free to leave them below. If you guys like this deck and you are interested in how I built this deck, there's actually a link to the stream VOD where we built this deck. This deck, the initial draft, was built by my stream and my stream chat with me on stream. It was like a 3 or 4 hour process that we built it over. That we have tweaked it and refined it and worked with it over time. And this is, I think, the most powerful version that we have decided on. So if you guys want to go check out the conception of this deck, you can go look over there. If you guys are interested in seeing my Twitch channel, where I actually play Magic 4 days a week over there, as well as other TCGs and Fallout and other stuff, please feel free to go check that out. Link to that as well in the description. If you guys have anything else, any other comments or any questions, if you guys like this video, dislike this video, all that stuff, please feel free to leave that down below. So, with all that being said, I'm going to let you guys go. Hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you next time.